Hello again, slightly different video today. What I want to do today is to talk you through an essay, the kind of essay that you might be expected to write for this particular question, show you why it's a good one. I'm going to live mark it and show you how to structure your own essay, which is going to be your next task. Right, excuse that pop-up if you saw it. I don't know whether it'll appear on your screen or not. Okay, so first thing to be aware of is that when you get your question, they will give you and print for you one of the poems. So I'm going to imagine that I've been given a copy of Exposure and told to choose one of the other 14 poems to compare it to, which is the structure of the question. And I've chosen to compare it to Charge of the Light Brigade because the two of them go very well together. So you'll be given a poem, it'll be printed in front of you, and then you pick one that you think goes with it. The other thing to be aware of is this issue here. We need to be considering context for both poems and comparing it and linking it to the message of the poems in order to get those higher grades. Right, so the introduction. In your introduction, I think you ought to say why you picked the two poems to go together. You ought to draw some similarities, certainly in content perhaps, or in the contexts, or in a technique, and you ought to also outline something different, a contrast between them. So here's mine. Both Exposure and Charge of the Light Brigade are written about specific wars, so we've got a strong link there, and both were written while these wars were ongoing. Both poems also make use of repeated phrasing and make use of imagery linked to religion. So several strong links between the poems there that say they're similar in these ways. However, while Charge is extolling the bravery and determination of the soldiers involved in a disastrous battle, Exposure presents the more mundane aspects of war, the boredom and worry of a stalemate situation, and the dreadful conditions the soldiers in the World War I trenches were exposed to. So we've got similarities, and then we've got differences. And you can see that I'm using kind of language of compare and contrast there. So both, however, to signal that this is going to be the same and this is going to be different. Then, to be sure I deal with it, I'm going to talk about context. Exposure was written by Wilfred Owen, an infantry officer who lived and fought alongside his men in the trenches until his death in the very last week of the war. It's set in the winter of 1916 to 17, an unusually harsh winter across Western Europe, and a time when the fighting between the two sides had largely reached a stalemate. Unlike many war poems, it does not describe battles, but instead discusses the tedium of weeks of waiting for action to begin, presenting the terrible winter weather as the main enemy instead of a German army. Owen's personal experience is clearly reflected in this poem, making it feel true and authentic in its description of the icy winters at Nivers. So I've talked there about Owen's personal context and why that fits the poem. So the poem is about the winter weather, I've got a quote about the winter weather, and I've tied it into the fact that he was there. And then we've got our signalling. Here's the compare and contrast language. In contrast, the writer of Charge had no military experience, so a straightforward sentence that says this is different because. Tennyson read about the battle in a London newspaper a few days after it happened and was inspired to write a poem describing the bravery of the troops and their obeying of their officers without question, even when the orders were, in this case, not just foolish but based on miscommunication from above. While it makes no attempt to hide the fear and terror of the battle, into the mouth of hell, the overriding message is one of pride in the men, and the poem urges the reader to remember their sacrifice and bravery also. Always, I beg your pardon. And then we've got some comparison of context. So we've talked about context of Exposure, we've talked about context for Charge, and now we're comparing the two. The fact that Tennyson did not participate in or even witness the battle may have made it easier for him to focus on these aspects of the battle, unlike Owen's more cynical, depressed tone stemming from his personal involvement in the war. Owen's opening words, "Our brains ache," reminds us that he was part of the army that underwent the struggles he described. On the other hand, Tennyson's use of the third person demonstrates his lack of personal participation. So this is about comparison of context, but here I begin to talk about a technique, and the technique I'm talking about here is the use of the first and third person. So I'm comparing techniques and I'm linking to context. Okay, going on. Exposure uses repeated imagery of nature as a greater enemy than the Germans. Even daybreak, usually a welcome relief in difficult situations, is described as a melancholy army, and the occasional bullets flying over are less deadly than the air. This culminates in the poet stating that even God doesn't seem to care for the men. Love of God seems dying, a significant idea, as Owen himself planned to become a church minister before the war but lost his faith. Okay, so we're talking about imagery here. We're now talking about language. We're making points about exposure, and then we're going to compare that to points about charge. So, repeated imagery of nature as a greater enemy. Here's an example. Here's an example. And then this idea that it ties in with his loss of faith. And there we're I link analysis of language or commentary about language to context by saying that this is where Owen's faith loss is kind of hinted at in the poem. Charge, oh here's my contrast, remember we're talking about language, also draws on religious imagery, so there's a link there, isn't there? Owen's reference to God, Charge's reference to religious imagery, such as comparing the battlefield to hell and alluding to the 23rd Psalm in the line the valley of death, so talking about the Bible there. Both poems contain repeated phrasing, so this idea that they say the same thing over and over, with exposure's refrain but nothing happens, creating a sense it will be boredom and cold that kill the men, not the enemy, and Charge using a structure of repeated lines to build to increasingly longer stanzas, reflecting the feelings of the men as they frantically tried to capture the cannons and return safely to base. So we've moved a little bit onto structure there, but we're still dealing with some linguistic pieces within that as well. And then I'm going to talk about clear structure now. Structurally, Charge makes use of a dactylic rhythm, which echoes the sound of the cantering horses ridden by the soldiers. So a dactylic rhythm is one where the first beat is stressed and the following beats are unstressed. So in Charge, it's the first beat and then two quieter beats, as in half a league, half a league. But, it's a long, narrow stanza, so think about how it looks skinny on the page. It can also be seen as reflecting the narrow valley floor along which the battle took place. Exposure, so we've got something about structure in Charge, and then we move on to structure in Exposure. Has an unusual rhyme scheme, which I don't write down, and then point out that the rhymes are half rhyme, not full rhyme, which create, and talk about why that is. Oh, because it creates a nervous, uncomfortable feel, which echoes the feeling of the soldiers. And a shortened final line in each stanza to underline the poet's message of the futility of war. Remember, we're talking about messages. We've already said that Charge wants us to be proud of the soldiers. Owen wants us to be aware of how futile he believes war to be. And then we come on to the conclusion. Though both poems are about particular wars and both seek to expose, and I'll put expose in speech marks there because it reminds us of the poem Exposure, the truth of particular experiences, the fact that the writer of Charge was not involved in the battle he wrote about means the tone is much more exclamatory and patriotic than Exposure's more depressed but realistic depiction of the depredation and difficulties experienced by British soldiers. This difference shows that the writers had very different agendas. Again, we're talking about message, the writer's intention, very, very important there. Tennyson wished the noble sacrifices of the soldiers to be seen as brave and glorious, whereas Owen wanted the British public to understand the dreadful reality of life in the trenches. So your conclusion again reminds us that there are similarities, but talks more about differences and links very firmly to message. So we're getting the poet's messages across and linking what we've said about the poems to that. So, as far as the structure of an essay might look, you've got an introduction, and in your introduction what I want you to do is to talk about similarities, so you can, and which justifies your second choice really, and says I've picked them because they're similar in this way, and also talk about some differences. And you might include differences in context there, or difference in language, or difference in theme. But these are quite brief, okay, because it's your introduction. You're going to go into those in more detail a bit later on in the essay. Then you want a section on context, so you don't forget to do them. I would do poem 1, then I would do poem 2, and then I might do compare and contrast the two contexts. But the important thing to be aware of with context is it needs to be context that's actually relevant, because when we're not careful, we end up just writing everything we know about the poets, and that doesn't actually get you particularly high grades. Your next section is some language analysis of both poems, ideally. You've got no excuse for not doing some analysis of language of a poem that's printed in front of you, but hopefully you can remember some quotes as well from the poem that you're choosing to compare it to. So it's a compare and contrast. And once again, if you can, link to the poet's message. What are they saying? Why are they saying it? Why have they used that language to try and get it across? That's section 2, isn't it? Section 3, a little bit on structure. And the same rules apply. Compare and contrast, and also link to the messages. So we'll just put C above, and then your conclusion. And in your conclusion, you need to do what I've said above, so you need to briefly mention the similarities, say a bit more about differences, and then link the differences to the messages from the poets. I'm just going to finish writing this. Link differences to poets' messages. Okay, hopefully that's quite clear for you, and you can see now how you can write your essay.